listeners, and welcome to the last episode of Cognitive Dissonance. As usual, I'm your host, I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Don't worry, the podcast is not going anywhere, but this will be the last episode that we publish under the brand of Cognitive Dissonance. We'll be switching to the Jacob Shapiro podcast on Monday. You don't have to do anything. You will stay subscribed. Everything is fine, but if you see some new artwork and a new name for the podcast as it pops up on Monday, that's why, and I'll explain in the intro to the Monday episode why we are making that change. We were actually going to post this particular episode last Friday, but in a really ironic twist of fate, our fearless podcast producer and editor got sick, so he couldn't put it out last Friday, and we decided to save it for this Friday because I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to record over July 4th anyway. And it's a little bit of a step back from the day-to-day of geopolitics and instead looking at some trends in biotech, both from the investment perspective, from a personal perspective, and everything in between. You might remember the last episode that I did with Rob was about artificial intelligence, which has become a boom, maybe even a bubble, although I know Rob will quibble with me about that. And this episode takes as its starting off point, is there a bubble happening with Ozempic and other GLP-1s and some of these weight loss drugs that have hit the market? And from there, we back into what are investment implications? What does this mean about the health of nations? All sorts of things tied to that. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and we will see you on Monday with our rebrand and our episode with our special guests. So otherwise, take care of the people you love. Cheers and see you out there. All right, Rob, last time we were together, we talked about artificial intelligence, but today we're going to talk about the other big boom that's happening in markets, which is treating fat people. Is that too insensitive? I'm just looking at a stock chart of Eli Lilly over the past year. We're up from roughly 449 to 904. If you look at it from the past 5 years, I mean, man, if you had bought Eli Lilly at the sort of COVID-19 pandemic lows, you'd be up almost 10x. That's good enough to be Nvidia right there. And obviously, the reason that Eli Lilly and some of these companies are experiencing this massive growth is Ozempic, or this class of drugs that is being used to make people skinnier. I did a little research about how many people have been using these. It's actually kind of amazing. 13% of U.S. adults have used GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic. That's 1 in 8 Americans, which is kind of a lot. And half of those, or about 6 of those, report that they are currently taking one of those drugs. There's been some controversy around them in the sense that you're losing weight, but what's the long-term impact of that? Like, one of the things that I've seen most commonly cited is, yes, you're losing weight, but you're losing muscle. And you're actually not getting that much healthier if you're dropping weight, but you're dropping more weight than you are, more muscle than you are fat. If that ratio is going in the wrong direction, you're actually in some ways kind of worse off for it. And who knows, maybe in the long term, people will find other side effects of these things. But it's sort of uncontroversial that not being heavy is good for your health. It decreases chances of cardiovascular events and things like that. So I thought, we talked about AI. Let's talk about the other big boom that's happening, because outside of the AI stocks and sort of the ones that are tied to this specific corner of healthcare, it's a pretty choppy market out there. I'll turn it over to you from there. What do you think of this? Because I know that you had a take on sort of this being the last of the old style blockbuster drugs.
Yeah. Well, just before I get into that, I just want to point out this is a boom that's been going on for a very long time. When I was first in the business as a short seller, I think I was working on Krispy Kreme donuts for one company like that. And an older, more experienced analyst came to me and said, "Rob, don't ever short fat people." And that's been an adage that we've kind of kept to heart. And, that's been true for many, many years. Don't ever short Americans eating bad things. And this is sort of the offset of that. So this has been creating stock market value for many, many years. And this is sort of the most extreme manifestation. But yeah, it is just alluding to what you're saying. I think this is truly one of the final kind of blockbuster drugs, as you pointed out, in large part because of the type of behaviors that it targets. So Ozempic and GLP-1s as a class in general, the way they work is the mechanism reduces your desire to eat. So it's changing sort of a behavioral element that contributes to obesity and overweight. And if you look historically, like I remember 20 years ago, Lipitor was the blockbuster drug. Again, treating the same sort of chronic behavioral related diseases. And this is in the same boat. And when you think about what it takes to create a drug, except for something like an mRNA vaccine for COVID or something that's truly of global scale and of sudden importance, it requires that you target these sorts of things, that you target some bad behavior that many, many, many people are doing, and that they do in a chronic way. Because the best business model is a recurring revenue business model, as every business analyst knows. And with GLP-1s, if you stop taking them, you stop getting the effect of compressed or suppressed appetite, and you get fat again unless you change your actual behavior and not in an artificial way. So this is in many ways a throwback, I think, is what we're getting at here.
Yeah, I mean, but can you think of I guess maybe did Pfizer take off after it introduced Lipitor? I guess I should look at a chart of Pfizer. Like, I can't remember anything being taken up with quite the level of exuberance here, and also with the level of doubt about. I mean, you sort of alluded to Krispy Kreme, but I think you mentioned on the podcast a couple of weeks ago that Coca-Cola was at an all-time high. So even as the GLP-1 stocks are going to the moon, they're 10xing like Nvidia. The stocks that you would think would be constrained by increased health consciousness or decreased appetites on the part, and I would say not just of American eaters, but eaters all around the world. If you look at obesity rates, they're happening in developing markets and emerging markets. Like, it's sort of it's not a distinctly American phenomenon. We're just doing it more than everybody else. And here in Louisiana, we're doing it particularly bad. I think half the state is obese, literally. Um, but yeah, it just. I guess the question there is this a bubble? Like, are you expecting the exuberance around some of these stocks, which seem to just be printing money because of the interest in Ozempic, to eventually fall off, or is there something real here? Have they discovered something that's going to power cash flow for the next 30 years?
Bubble is a tricky word, and I think it's one that people use a lot to describe a lot of different things. This is not a bubble in the same way that NVIDIA is not really a bubble, because there's a fundamental reality underpinning it, which is explosive growth. This is what we would describe as a cyclical short. So, in other words, where people are taking a recent result and they're extrapolating it literally out into the future. And if I hate to talk about NVIDIA so much, but it's actually a pretty useful comparison because some of the elements are the same. If you read what the street expectations are for these companies and for GLP-1s as a class, the expectation is that something like 100 million Americans will eventually take these drugs. 350 million people in America, 42.5% of Americans are obese, including 19.4% of pediatrics. So the idea is that something like half of all obese people classified as obese, which I believe is a BMI over 35, will want to and will take these forever on a regular basis. So that's what's getting baked into the numbers. And then most importantly, the current annual run rate for these drugs is $15,000 a year. If you look at what the street models are assuming in terms of sort of the TAM, the total attainable market, they're assuming that this is, at least a $100 billion market because prices don't go down very much. So it's similar to NVIDIA, and I say that because what many people are sort of neglecting here is that as you get to scale, prices go down dramatically because competition naturally comes in. And in this case, drugs are unique because there's patent protection. It's not an open field, but there are a significant number of different types of GLP-1s. Essentially, if you try to back into those numbers and say, well, who's going to pay for these? Like, are Americans going to pay out of pocket? Almost certainly not. Some payer has to step in and foot the bill. And even those numbers don't make sense. there was a professor of economics at MIT who pointed out that if the US government were to approve this via Medicare and Medicaid, it would cost about $1 trillion of deficit to support this. So over some time period. So um, linear projections again don't really work, and I think that's what's happening in this case. Um, Probably, I don't know if that's going to be the overall penetration rate over time, but certainly not at $15,000 a year. And I think if it were, the implications from an economic standpoint and just from a ick factor for America would be pretty profound.
Yeah, I struggle with this one a lot. I think often of Brene Brown, that famous. I don't know what is she, a social work researcher. In one of her famous TED talks, she talks about how 100 years from now, people will look back at the fact that we took fat out of our butts and injected it into our cheeks and into our lips to make ourselves look nicer. And I sort of have that same feeling about this. Like 100 years from now, we'll talk about how these drugs that suppress appetite and make you like less muscular, we spent $1 trillion on that because the population got too fat eating processed. Like there's just like some sort of disconnect for me there. But I guess there's two directions that I wanted to take this, and I'll let you decide which direction we go first. Because the first direction is biotech is one of the sectors we love the most. And in our innovation strategy, biotech it's one of the main sort of pillars of that strategy. Um, so I thought we could talk about what this means for biotech in general. But then the door number two is there an increasing level of health consciousness among younger Americans, whether it's Gen X or particularly millennials or Gen Z? Because there's a narrative out there that the millennials want to be healthier, they want better food, they want more exercise. And I can't tell if that's real or if it's just every generation thinks they're going to do that, and we're recycling some of those old narratives. I have some personal anecdotes to add into that as well. Which of those doors do you want to go through first? We'll get through both of them.
Let's do the generational one because I think that opens the conversation into behaviors and sort of self-reinforcing behaviors that are encouraged by what you see around you. Um, I've seen these stories. Like I know we were talking about the New York Times piece about people are going out for dinner in Manhattan at 5 o'clock because it's healthier and stuff like that. One of the pitfalls that we always talk about when we're doing research on something is that our view of things is so skewed by the fact that we are, millennials that live in higher income areas that consume media that is generally tilted towards a certain type of person, education level, things like that. And over again, this gets you into trouble because I don't think that represents the average American at all. And I don't say that just off the cuff. The numbers just don't support that. Obesity levels overall are steadily climbing. As I mentioned, obesity levels among pediatrics are steadily climbing. So if I mean pediatrics, just to be clear, are our kids. So if millennials are really so health conscious as a group, are they being health conscious for themselves but allowing their children to become fat on average? I mean, it's very difficult to believe. So I think the narrative like that works in certain rarefied bubbles like Manhattan and Boston and Los Angeles and Austin. But for the overall population, and maybe this gets to behavioral reinforcement and more cultural issues, the overall population, the numbers just don't support that very much, and that's a major problem.
Well, and it's tale as old as time of people selling their wares or offering some kind of product or some kind of regimen that is going to make you live forever. I mean, that's literally like go back to basically every single major civilization. Somebody is saying that they found the secret to longevity. And there does seem to be like a cottage industry of that emerging and people who are sort of selling the latest things. And it's across the spectrum. It's Joe Rogan talking about how you need to eat elk meat versus the GLP-1s versus the vegans who are on the other side of this don't eat any meat at all. But I will say, like, I've had my own little personal journey with this, and maybe that means that you can't extrapolate it at all. But you might remember Jordy Visser came on the podcast. This was years ago now. And one of the things he talked about was wearables. And he had an interesting justification for it. He basically said, look, the US healthcare system sucks. I don't want my sort of, I'm not going to trust the US healthcare system to keep me healthy. If I can get data about where I am myself from a health perspective and I can be proactive about treating myself, I'm going to do that. And he turned me on to Aura rings, and I decided to buy an Aura ring after that conversation and was playing around with it. And then I sort of modified some of my behavior a little bit after that, but not a whole lot. Like I was still sort of normal. I thought of myself as like a very healthy person. And then, ironically, not in any sort of metropolis or liberal bubble, I was giving a talk in North Dakota, and one of the guys there was a farmer, and he knows who he is. I know you're listening. I won't call out your name, but thank you for the recommendation. He recommended to me Peter Attia's book, Outlive, which all the tech bros love Peter Attia, and he's got tons of clients, and he's a controversial figure in and of his own right. But I read that book, and I was like, literally, I started changing my habits. I like decreased my alcohol intake by a substantial amount. I started prioritizing sleep for the first time in my life. I used to joke that I could sleep when I'm dead. I don't joke about that anymore now. I'm like, you're lucky if you see me past 9:30 p.m. because I'm trying to get my 7 or 8 hours in, which is a radical change in my behavior. Anybody who knows me from like my college days remembers me closing down the library at 2 a.m. every night, not going to bed at 9:30 was nap time so that I could make it to 3 a.m. in the morning. All of which is to say, I feel like I have changed considerably. And when something happens to you personally, you kind of want to look out at the macro data, and your impulse is to say, well, everybody's like me. This must be happening everywhere. So maybe it's not happening everywhere. But boy, once you sort of like listen to Peter Attia, and sort of the Instagram algorithm knows that you're interested in that stuff, it feels like it's constant. And whether it's Andrew Huberman or now all these other folks that are out there talking, what is that guy, Chris Williamson? Like there's just all this content that is being created around being healthier. And I don't know, like tell me that I'm just sort of the outlier here, and that people are still just doing the things that they used to do.
But I think you've identified a real important factor, which is the influence of technology and media to reinforce behaviors within groups of people of similar leanings. So we live in a very strange situation where you have sort of this going on in an accelerated way, right? Like, who's the guy? I forget his name. The guy who spent $2 million on like injecting his teenage son's blood into himself, and he's doing all these podcasts. I mean, my point is very extreme, very extreme. You know, people moving into the areas of health, and this is reinforced by their ability to share information, to share ideas, to broadcast what they're doing, to attract followers. And that, in many ways is kind of doing its own thing, accelerated by technology. At the same time, like let me give an investment related anecdote that I think illustrates this. It's around 2021 that models in online advertising started really being fat. And I don't mean plus size models. I mean fat people as models in ads. And that sounds silly, but there was a noticeable change, and some companies pivoted to this early and successfully, and some did not, and they kind of suffered. But there was a sudden cultural shift right around COVID, where previously it was generally unacceptable to have a fat model. And again, I'm not using plus size because that's a euphemism for like a slightly larger woman, usually. Like these people are very overweight. And that has become a norm just in the last few years in online advertising. And what I say that for is to really point out that at the same time you have these sort of very narrow, self-reinforcing communities that are forming and sharing information using the internet, you also have less positive reinforcement mechanisms happening. So like I went to visit my family this weekend in Connecticut, and I was talking to my cousin, to my nephew, who's 15 years old, and he showed me a picture of his chorus. He sings in the chorus, and I said, all the people in this picture are fat, not chubby, fat. And he said, "Oh yeah, that's the norm now." He said everyone is encouraged to be proud to be overweight, like really overweight, like it's no big deal, like you just do you, that sort of mentality. And it's a real, I hope I'm not going to get in trouble with this here, but
Rob,
it's a
if you were
nefarious
worried
sort
about
of.
getting in trouble, you should have worried about it about 18 minutes ago. You're well down the hole, my friend.
Are you even allowed to say fat anymore? I don't even know. Um, but the influence of technology in positive and negative ways in reinforcing these things is really powerful, and that gets to behavioral modification and your ring, and sort of this notion of um, how do you create your own personal reinforcement using technology in a positive way, or not.
Well, that's to me maybe the secret sauce here because I mean I can only speak. Well, actually, I did a continuous glucose monitor for a hot second there too, and that was too much data. That was like after every meal you had to log it, and then you watched what your blood sugar did, and it was like, man, pizza really does like I understand now why I feel shitty the day after pizza because my blood sugar did this and it went like this. But that was too much. Like it was too depressing. But with the Aura Ring itself, like I've gotten to the point where I'm incredibly dependent on it, almost to the point where I can't decide how I feel when I wake up until I look at my data and see, well, how much deep sleep did I get? And what did my heart rate get down to? And what was my HRV last night? Like I need to understand all of these things together. And it was the thing that actually forced me to change my behavior because I wasn't susceptible to any of these types of arguments before. It was only after I could see from a data perspective, okay, this is what having 3 drinks at 9 p.m. does to your body the next day. Like, here's what happens to your heart rate, and here's what happens to your sleep cycle, and blah, blah, blah. And it took like a year of watching the data, but eventually I sort of understood, like, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to feel good. I want to check the boxes on the wearable. And so after for 12 months, the Aura reporting data stuff is free. And then it's, do you want to continue the Aura data reporting? That's $5.99 a month. And I was like, of course I want to continue that. I would have paid way more than $5.99 a month. I hope nobody from Aura is listening. But I think you're right. There was something about the data there that was really powerful. And there were two really powerful parts of the Peter Attia book that really stuck with me. But the first one was just this idea, and it's the one that Jordy mentioned on this podcast, of being proactive, of not waiting to diagnose something and then get treated for it, but saying, hey, can you get indicators ahead of time so that you can actually have a fighting chance to get some of these things? Because if you don't have an advanced indicator, like it's not like the U.S. healthcare system is built to prevent anything; it's there to treat things. In exactly the same way that you were talking about drugs, the drugs that do well are ones that are for chronic conditions that everybody has. So in some ways, you're incentivized to like continue to sell the drug to more people with the condition, right? It's sort of the same thing with food. The better farmers are at growing more amounts of high quality food, the lower the price of food becomes, the more farmers go out of business. It's like the better the product actually is for the human being, the worse it actually is for the person who's developing it. And I don't know how you get around. I'm rambling a little bit there, but I do think there's something about the wearable and the data space that has been really powerful for me. And I have to think that if you had more people exposed to their data, that it would be the same. One example of this, I don't know if you know this, the NBA around the time of COVID required their players, I believe, to wear Aura rings because they were trying to get advanced indicators about who had COVID so that they could self-isolate ahead of time rather than waiting for the COVID test after the fact. Like, it's not that big of a stretch to imagine that at your kid's daycare, they're going to require you to have a wearable. And if they get a high temperature reading the night before, that they will not let your kid into daycare, I mean, I don't know.
But notice the subtle difference in what you just described, because in the first case, you were talking about you using your own data independently and proactively. In the second one, you're talking about a third party monitoring and taking actions based on data they're collecting. And I think that's an important difference because there's always going to be a vanguard of people who are very proactive and data oriented, like, well educated, and generally they're going to be pretty healthy anyway. And when you think about this as a social phenomenon, as a something you need to think about as an investor or anyone, anticipating the future, that's not really, except for niche products, with very high value for that relatively small market. I don't think that's really the mainstream application here. I think it's more of the second model that you describe, because the average person, they really need to be smacked in the face, because part of the problem with obesity and lifestyle issues in so many ways is just having the capacity I don't mean intelligence. I mean the time and the mental space to think and to, control these things and to really, behavior is so much about little nudges and just stepping back and thinking critically about, hey, what am I, what am I doing right now? And that is, a deficit for so many people on average. They just don't have the leisure to think about, oh, how many calories are in this, or what are the ingredients of this thing. They just, it's going in the hole. Um, and I think that's the real big opportunity. And the thing that I'm most optimistic about here is, I say this is like the old style blockbuster drug, and I mean that in a negative way, because you don't fix something by just, artificially suppressing the symptom of behavior. The symptom of behavior is I'm going to eat a lot, so I'm going to artificially put this clamp on my appetite with unknown consequences long term, and reduced muscle mass and all these sorts of things. Like that's sort of a very old industrial style solution to the problem, much like farming. Like, just add more pesticide. Like, it's not too sustainable. um, but really, when you talk about wearables and data, and especially AI, because again, when you think about the notion of not having the capacity to be like, yeah, you probably shouldn't eat that donut, humans, even when they're lacking that, can supplement that with an AI that in the future, once it's better, we'll be able to say like, hey, when you have this thing for breakfast, your blood sugar goes up. So you really shouldn't do that. And just little nudges like that. Like, I saw this cool movie last weekend called Mars Express, and among many other ideas, it's a science fiction animated film. This woman who's an alcoholic, every time she goes to a bar and she tries to get a drink, a little clamp shows up on the nozzle of the whiskey and says, sobriety check, and it won't let her drink. And that's a very heavy-handed sort of vision of the future. But um, that, and or sort of more positive individual reinforcement that isn't so nanny state like, I think that's where a lot of people are going.
Well, and just to sharpen your point even more, because like this is going to sound banal, but I think we have to say it. Like every single person is different. So what is good for one person is not good for another person. So there are people who genetically like are going to be more heavy set. Like it doesn't matter what they eat. Like that's just the way that their bodies are going to be in certain cultures and in certain places like that. That's fine. And that's where the sort of line between unhealthy fatness and then, oh, this person looks different, so we're going to shame them. Like that's the big bright line here that you have to be really careful of. And the honest truth is probably the ideal weight and muscle mass and everything else for each individual person is probably completely different. It's probably bad for everyone to be super skinny, and it's probably bad for everyone to be super fat. It's bad to have one measuring stick for everyone. What it would be nice to have is to say, hey, you are, based on your genetic this and your need for nutrition and how your blood, blah, 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 this is your target weight. It's what's going to be best for you, sort of in the long run. And none of these things that we're talking about are there quite yet, but maybe they'll get there. And I think that's a good way to open the door to the biotech conversation. But before we do, I just want to the Peter Attia stuff and the sort of medical tech bro live forever stuff. Um, like I got seduced by it for a second, although I get seduced by every new idea that I come across. That's how I learn ideas. I like go hard on them and like imbibe them and then come back out for air. So I went hard at this one and then I came back up for air. But I thought the thing that was most impressive about Peter Attia's book Outlive, and why I would commend it to anyone, is because he has this whole it's very technical. It's and diet and this and how you should live forever. And then the last chapter is about how emotionally his life was a train wreck, and he had all these anger issues and all these perfection issues and workaholism and things like that. And it took almost losing his marriage and almost losing his family, where he checked himself into a clinic to deal with like anger management and addiction to work and stuff like that. And now he's a better person. And what started as a book about how to live forever became, it actually doesn't matter unless you're not happy. And I think one of the things that is missing in all the conversation about this is like mental health is more important than all of it. So like if the cheeseburger is what's going to give you like mental health, eat the cheeseburger. If the glass of wine is going to give you happiness, if you're going to be miserable sitting there watching the other people having the Aperol spritz, but you're like, I hate this, I can't have the drink. Like, just have the drink. Like, probably, I don't know if you saw this data in The Economist. It turns out that people from Spain and Portugal and Italy live the longest in Europe. And they can't explain it because these are people who are probably eating a lot of processed pork and drinking a lot of wine. And it probably has something to do with social interaction and the amount that they walk in their daily lives because of the way the cities are constructed. Like, none of this stuff is zero sum. And I feel like missing in the conversation about health itself is that none of it matters if you aren't also taking care of yourself personally. So I just want to put that in there. But maybe we now go through door number 2, which is biotech. I sort of opened the door about personalization, but why don't you take us to the next level there?
Well, I think the sort of corollary to what we were talking about with the old style blockbuster drugs is, this is the promise of genetic analysis and genetic editing, which is one of the general purpose technologies that we focus on a lot in terms of investment themes and identifying where things are going in the future. But this is just diametrically opposed to that model, because the whole idea with gene editing and gene analysis is that you can understand what makes each individual person tick, and you can do that in a increasingly cheap way, which enables you to create solutions, whether it's pharmaceuticals or whether it's just doing analysis to understand what kind of sort of behavioral reinforcement is needed. That opens up a whole another and much more positive door to enabling people to kind of have the tools for self-realization as an individual. And it's a much more positive future, but it's going to look very different from this notion of, hey, crank out 100 billion doses of GLP-1s for the same thing that everyone's doing badly in mass and struggling with this thing.
Well, but I mean, how does it work though from a business model perspective? Because the reason, like, it's not that the reason that the current system is the way that it is because that's what's profitable. So how do you feel like it's going to be profitable for some of these more individualized approaches to do well?
Well, right now, I mean, this goes back to the AI conversation we had last week as well. You're talking about sort of centralized solutions to things, which are an industrial mindset. If you build a factory, the factory has to crank out widgets that are the same, no matter what they look like. You can't customize them, you can't individualize them because you don't have the technology. It's way too costly. Like, that's how the modern economy works. And whether you're talking about sort of AI as sort of the apex of computing, or whether you're talking about sort of personalized medicine, which is something that still remains out of reach, really, but is within striking distance as we get closer and closer, and this gets cheaper and cheaper. Those cost constraints that force you to treat everyone the same begin to go down sufficiently where you can create more individualized solutions for people, whether it's in computing or in medicine. It's sort of like 3D printing for physical parts. All of a sudden, you no longer have to have a tooled machine for one part. You can use one machine to create many different parts, and you're not necessarily incurring unattractive economics to do so. And it's a very different approach to what we're used to, and a lot of it still remains sort of in the future. But this is where the puck is going to.
It may be where the puck is going, but I mean, we've talked about regulatory problems, especially as it is tied to infrastructure on this podcast before. But like, let's think about the mRNA vaccines, for example, because companies like Moderna, they had the designs for their vaccines for COVID, a couple weeks after the DNA of the virus had been sequenced. It took as long as it did to get those shots into arms because there was, a regulatory process that usually takes years. They fast tracked it. So it only took, I forget, what was it, 8 months or 12 months or whatever it was. And we got the shots in the arms. By the way, just remarkable to me now that people don't even like think about the shots or want the shots. I think it's like a minor miracle every time I get my COVID booster because I'm like, this is like literally like enjoy the fruits of living in 2024. It's really, really hot and there's going to be terrible hurricanes, but you get like shots that like literally were designed out of thin air. Like our ancestors would have killed for this shit. Anyway, sorry. But just to say, like, I mean, if we can't even get the regulatory apparatus to think about infrastructure in a productive way, like just I have trouble imagining that the regulatory apparatus for individualized medicine is going to respond in any meaningful way. I mean, that's a really hard thing set in stone, and all it takes is one bad reaction to set off a firestorm in the other direction. No.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the whole apparatus is not made for this, which is why I think the notion of individualized drugs is still, that's not today. That's not happening in the near term. But within the realm of health, what you can do without that regulatory burden are the sorts of things like behavioral reinforcement, even apps today that just, give little nudges. I mean, that's the very low grade version of, eventually an AI assistant that's with you all the time, that's, kind of has unlimited mental capacity to push you in the positive directions that you wouldn't otherwise. That's not going to help you if you have some rare disease, but it will help you if your issue, as the vast majority of Americans' issue is primarily about negative behavioral changes or changes that need to be made. So in the near term, I think the way to think about it is devices, sort of personalized data, personalized behavioral nudges are here, and they're going to just accelerate in a major way. And then the other stuff, I think it's going to take a major change in the way that the whole apparatus thinks. I mean, just look, even this GLP-1 issue. So the issue around reimbursement is that they're trying to, the main sort of spokes group for GLP-1s is trying to claim that obesity itself is a disease. And this is people talk about the obesity epidemic, and they use this sort of language. As if, this is something that you contracted on the subway or something like and that's sort of how things work, is we are used to treating these behavioral things as diseases that need to be cured, just like cholesterol. That's a disease. We're going to give everyone on earth a Lipitor or the generic equivalent because, I mean, you see where I'm going with this, but it all gets down to sort of agency and the perceived lack thereof, giving people the tools to have agency, and the existing regulatory mechanism basically being in place to, treat things in that old style way where you have to treat everyone the same. And that's in many ways unavoidable because you need to test for safety and obviously make sure that these things actually work. Like there's a very good process in place for a reason, but changing that is going to be a huge lift.
Yeah, our friend Matt McClintock, who's been on the podcast before, he recently recommended the book The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleyman to us both. And I've been stuck in jury duty multiple days the last week, so I read the whole book in the span of 2 days in a lightless basement of the Orleans parish court. I didn't tell you this, Rob. I got out fairly lucky. So my last day of jury duty was Wednesday. The day before, apparently, they kept the people there until 10 p.m. 10 p.m. Can you imagine how angry I would have been if I had been kept there until 10 p.m. not to do anything? Anyway, but he actually has Suleiman I'm talking about now has a very scary chapter in his book about how the cost of like doing things with DNA is coming down to the point where you could do like DNA basically in your garage, like cut strands of DNA yourself and put things together. And the sort of combination of artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, and robotics sort of all coming together at a time when the country certainly is not its best self politically, socioeconomically, sort of from a health basis, however you look at it. There is a dark side to all of this too. That is more than a little bit scary if you start to go down that route.
Yeah, I mean, like any technology, it has horrific potential and amazing potential all at the same time, right? I think the notion, I mean, just getting back to what we were talking about last time around centralization and decentralization and empowering individuals as opposed to empowering these monolithic central groups, like that's what technology is. Technology enables people as an individual to do things that they couldn't do before. Like one of the most terrifying aspects of the world is the fact that it's just cheaper and cheaper every year for someone to make a nuclear bomb. Like that's technology. And you know, at some level you're more subject to the whims of individual people and what they might do with increased power. And I don't think there's an easy solution to that other than using technology to try to protect the rest of us from the crazies.
Another really lovely thought. Um, in the context of our conversation, we've talked a lot about Americans, but I wanted to ask you, like, is like if we're looking at things like artificial intelligence and semiconductors, we're talking about very globalized supply chains, areas where the United States has significant advantage in some areas, but significant disadvantages in some areas. Like, there's a real case to be made that China will beat the United States on AI, and I'm not sure which case I would make, but you can make the case legitimately both ways. Is that true for biotech, or do you think that really is the United States is at the cutting edge here, or is it the U.S. and a small number of European companies? Like, what does the geographic breakdown of this sector look like when you're thinking about it for the future?
Right now, it's primarily a U.S. dominated field. I mean, I'm here in Cambridge right now, surrounded by the top of the top in biotech, and you can walk down the street and hear people, you know, talking about proteins and DNA. I mean, this is the epicenter of the world for that, and that's not going to change in the near term. I think what you're going to see is that will trickle out, you know, as you see more of these tools get cheaper, as you see more scope for entrepreneurialism. Like right now, it still costs upwards of $1 billion to bring a major drug to market. I mean, by definition, that's going to exclude the vast majority of companies. And the way that the infrastructure of the industry works is essentially you have these big central platforms, these pharmaceutical companies. And as an investor, the whole question is just about, all right, it's like someone's been has a deck of a hand of cards. I'm like, all right, well, you know, Pfizer has these cards and they're going to get this out of the deck and their portfolio looks like this and it's well positioned if this, you know, sort of area of inquiry works out, and they just gobble up the small startups and biotechs that are mostly emerging around here as well. It's mostly an issue of capital structure. You know, rather than just building these things in house, someone funds it on the outside, and then when it's clear that it's going to be successful, then they get bought by one of these, you know, monoliths. As the cost of developing drugs goes down, I think much like you're seeing already in software with AI, and the higher velocity of new software startups coming because it's so much easier to develop code. I think you're going to see a similar increase in velocity of biotech related startups and also the geographic breadth of where this stuff can happen. Because you no longer are so tethered to these geographic centers like Boston, Cambridge, like Cambridge, England. Like there's a handful of these places that predominantly don't exist, you know, outside of the U.S. Paris to a much lesser extent. You know, there's a small number in Europe, but that's a longer term trend. It is going to be favorable to everyone relative to the existing centers because it is a decentralizing trend. But we're still pretty early in that.
Yeah, and in our own innovation strategy, what's sort of the makeup of the companies that you're looking for when we're putting those in?
We kind of have a barbell approach in terms of the living systems theme or vector, as we like to say. So we own a number of the companies that are creating the gene sequencing platforms. So, you know, the long read and the short read sequencers. And by the way, that's a really interesting area because right now those companies are deeply out of favor because investors are worried about the growth because they've sort of saturated the academic markets to some extent, and the growth from academia and sort of very niche specialized research is slowed down. And everyone's sitting around saying, "Oh my God, well, when are commercial applications going to really pick up for these tools and for these companies?" Um, Part of our bet, just based on this notion of general purpose technologies, where every year the cost goes down, 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 and leading to wider and wider and more intense use. Like, I can tell you with some certainty, these tools are going to be used much more broadly 10 years from now than they are today. So it's a
Hmm.
really interesting time at the moment to pick these things up very cheap, because people with shorter time horizons, they just don't see the other side, even though you know it's there. So it's a nice opportunity in comparison to some other areas where, optimism is off the charts. But I said it was a barbell, so we're trying to, those are the picks and shovels companies. The other area where we're over indexed, so to speak, are, a handful of the big pharma companies, because ironically, those are also names that have been very deeply out of favor for a long time. Um, Big pharma was really popular in the early 2000s, uh, through kind of the 2010 period, when it was sort of like this blockbuster drug period, and everyone was, they were all making bank, and they had a lot of drugs that weren't going off patent. And then they've kind of been in the wilderness for the last 10 to 12 years, because a lot of the big drugs from the 90s and the 2000s went off patent. They've been trying to repopulate those portfolios with new drugs, and some companies haven't done that particularly well, but some of them have. And now, after many years of sort of reinvestment and reloading the holster, I think you're going to see a lot of that begin to play out, where they're harvesting more of that than they were before, both in the older ways, but also using the experience in sort of gene-based therapies and genetic analysis to develop drugs more efficiently and more cheaply. And I don't think that aspect is really recognized in the valuations of these companies. So, um, not the most exciting part of how to play that, but when you think about stability and kind of a competitive moat that can survive, through thick and thin over years and years, those are great businesses in that regard, because they are truly platforms, and that's not going to change for a very long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a nice barbell approach.
Before I let you get out of here, so we did a nice little conversation about health. The world still continues to go on. Kenyan protesters stormed parliament and burned parts of it. China and Poland talking about EVs. Bolivia had an attempted coup. I don't know if you saw that today. It failed. Anything in particular on the top of your mind, or are you just worried about what version of France you're going to get when you come back to it in a week or two?
Well, the French thing has been top of mind for sure. Um, by the way, speaking of behavioral reinforcement, I looked this up in preparation for this. Can you guess what the obesity rate in France is? In the U.S., it's 42.4%. In France, do you know?
I'm gonna guess 22.6%.
15%.
Damn! Wow, skinny people.
And I couldn't even find a pediatric obesity rate, presumably because they don't even bother to track it. I've never seen, uh, really, I think, one really overweight kid in France. Um,
I'm going to make a joke here. I know that it's a joke, but I'm warning you guys that it's a joke. That you, of course, also can't get a French government percentage on the percent of the population that is Muslim, because they don't count it, because everybody is supposed to be French, and that's not supposed to matter. So for all we know, there are tons of fat French people, but they're all French, so they don't need to count it. Viva la liberté!
yeah. So, so
No,
yeah,
but no,
interesting.
but actually, your point is taken. Like, one of the things that Peter Attia talks about this in his book too, and I sort of alluded to it when I talked about that Economist article about Spain and Portugal and Italy. Like, very few things with nutrition seem to actually be clear to people. Like, there are a lot of grandiose claims out there, but the science is actually much squishier than you would like. One of the few things that is really clear is that alcohol is bad for you, and yet, you go to a country like France, people live longer, people are happier, and people are skinnier, even though, like, there's no shortage of drinking wine in France. So there's something happening in some of these countries, where even the stuff that is unassailable from a sort of scientific point of view, just in the lab, doesn't quite work. There's something else happening, some aspect of health that is not being captured by the data that we're using.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell you what it is, because you see all these books that are, why do French women not get fat, and all of these things. It's 100% behavioral reinforcement around, patterns of social eating. People just don't eat snacks. They don't eat. They eat contained portions, and like the family structure, it's behavioral reinforcement at the level of the family primarily, because people don't eat very big portions. They don't eat outside of meal times and like one specific snack time. So they eat whatever, not whatever they want, because obviously there's a consciousness around you want to eat less of this and more of that. But for the most part, people kind of enjoy themselves. And because you have structures, like the thing that strikes me so much about the US being able to look one against the other is we have no structure in the US. It's just like eat, whatever, in your car. Like, that is the primary issue. It's like, in my own experience, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, like so much of just being healthy is about having some kind of rule. It's like, it could be totally arbitrary, but just having something that you do tends to reinforce better outcomes. And I think it just shows, like in these nations where you have these behavioral norms around eating that are more intact. It's, the numbers don't lie. That's a huge gap. And it's a Western industrialized nation. They're eating the same shit pretty much, or they have access to the same shit as everyone else if they wanted to. There's some non-material, non-nutritional factor that's at work, and I'm pretty sure that behavior is the one. And that, by the way, is really positive for the future of Americans, because if that is truly so important at the margin, then technology and tools and things that can reinforce the behaviors that people really do want to do, we just don't have the capacity to do it, and it's not easy. I think you'll see, I've said in the past, I think we've seen the bottom for obesity, or the top. Like, I still believe that to be true for that reason.
Well, and so much of, I see this most clearly when I'm in airports. If you're going on a flight in Europe, like if you're leaving from France going somewhere in Europe versus you're in the United States and you're going somewhere else in the United States, like you're going to get offered shitty snacks and God knows how many free drinks of alcohol or alcohol that you could pay for on top of it. Like I could very easily, like if I get upgraded to first class on a flight or something like that, just let's say to Minneapolis or something, I could easily have 6 free drinks, like by the time I'm like from one place to the other. And when somebody, like it's sort of the opposite of what you're talking about, something, telling you to reinforce good habits, it's like reinforcing the bad habits. It's like, ooh, here, have some chips and have a whiskey and have a happy hour. And it's happy hour somewhere. So it doesn't matter that it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Have a margarita with your breakfast burrito, like whatever else. Whereas if you get on a flight in Europe, like the stuff is still available, but it's not at all the same way. And when you get on the flight, like it won't be chips or cookies or something like that. Like I remember I was on KLM recently. I guess it was last year. I think I was going to Geneva, and the snack was a cheese sandwich on like whole grain bread. It was amazing. I was like, why can't I have this on like the flight in the United States? Anyway, that's a very, very small sample size. But yeah, to your point, I feel like one of the hardest things is that it's hard to have self-discipline, even for the most self-disciplined people. And then when you're constantly fed all of this junk, like it's just hard to say no. And I do think that's sort of where we are. So maybe that will change. Maybe you're right. Although it seems to me that your optimism at the end there, you said that maybe we've reached the top for fat. You're literally going against the never short fat people conclusion that you began the podcast with, aren't you?
Well, every piece of investment wisdom at some point becomes untrue, because it kills itself, and I think we're at that point. The bottom is in.
The fat is in. The wide is in. This is the wide. We need something different.
Long spinach, short Krispy Kreme. That's my trade of the decade.
Yeah, I think I'll take the other side of that one. All right, I'll let you get on with it, Rob. Thanks for seeing me. I'll see you next week.
All right, man.
The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.